Just kind of look at that for yourself, and you can have an idea of how students might also be interpreting some of their emotions and feelings, and how that might lead them to having an anxiety disorder, which is something that Leslie, as far as the university, she'll get into talking about a little bit later regarding access services and how having a specific diagnosis as opposed to just feeling anxious, how that feeds into the classroom and what you all do in the classroom. But first of all, I am Andrea Mills, the Assistant Director of the Counseling Center, and I also teach adjunct in the psychology department 2 classes and one in the nursing program and engagements course. And definitely interact with students that have anxiety there in the professor role as well as in the counseling center in a counseling role. So looking at it from both sides, I see the struggle on both ends and how it can be different depending on the role you play in the student's life. So we'll discuss a little bit of that, but that's my role here.
And I'm Leslie Beach. I'm the Director of the Accessibility Services on campus. So any student who needs accommodations comes through my office. So we just kind of work with professors and students to work through what that looks like for them specifically. It can vary between every student and every class. So
that's a lot of students.
Yes.
So our objectives for today is just to establish a definition of anxiety. Exactly what does that mean? Because it's used kind of loosely in our society today when we talk about anxiety. And then explore how those symptoms can manifest in your classrooms. What does that look like translated from, say, an anxiety inventory like this to actually sitting in a classroom setting with the students. Defining the role of access services and understanding the law and student rights regarding those accommodations. I get those questions a lot directed into the counseling center, but she is the expert on all things legal and ethical in that area, so I'll let her handle that. And then just some time, we'll have plenty of time to discuss toward the end any specific issues, because a lot of times when people come to sessions such as this, there's a specific issue that they've had in a classroom that maybe they want to talk about how to handle it, and we'll even do that in a collaborative nature as well, because I'm sure some of you have navigated some of these situations really well in the past and may have some insight to provide regarding those types of things. Currently, we are seeing over 200 students a week in the counseling center dealing with anxiety. We're seeing over 320 students a week at the counseling center, and we have a waiting list of 15 to 20 students right now. It is packed over there. And it's a good problem to have in that students are accessing services, but what it tells us is there is a real issue. Specifically, anxiety is far and away the top issue that we see students for, followed by depression. Now, that's not necessarily clinical depression as diagnosed, and I think that's a great topic for another time, but we'll specifically be focusing on not those crisis situations, but the anxiety component today. So the first thing that I kind of discuss with students is anxiety. Is this like a friend or a foe? Can it be a good thing? Because when we think of anxiety, we all automatically jump to a negative thing. Anxiety is bad. But anxiety is really more just information. Just like when you go to the doctor and they ask how much pain you have, and that pain is information as to where there might be a problem. Anxiety is really information first and foremost about what do we care about. Because if we didn't care, we wouldn't necessarily be anxious about that thing. So it can provide information as to what matters to us and what we care about. The other thing when it comes to anxiety that makes it not necessarily a foe is as long as it doesn't interfere with your functioning, it can really be something that motivates a person. So certain levels of anxiety are not bad. And I think that's a mindset that's shifted over time to where people feel like any level of anxiety is a negative thing. But if it's not interfering with the person's daily life, we don't consider it something to be fixed necessarily. More as information, and then also sometimes people need extra support through a particularly difficult period in time like college can be. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a disorder there that needs to be dealt with. Because having anxiety and having an anxiety disorder, a disorder is when it's actually interfering with your life in some way, in functioning, like normal daily functioning in some way. We'll talk a little more about that. So what is anxiety? The this is just a nice little definition, but anxiety is your body's natural response to stress. So it's a natural response. You are supposed to feel it to some degree. It's a feeling of fear or apprehension about what's to come. The first day of school, going to a job interview, or giving a speech can cause most people to feel fearful and nervous to some degree. I've noticed a shift from when I started counseling to now that the word apprehension now has more of a negative connotation than it used to. When you were apprehensive about something, in this generation, they consider that more negative, where I used to think of it as more like an excitement about something coming up, something I was excited about. I've tended to see a shift towards apprehension being like a stressful thing, a difficult thing, and viewed more in the lens of anxiety. So what we're really going to talk about some today is if your feelings are extreme, if they last for longer than 6 months, or are interfering with your life, you may have an anxiety disorder, which is diagnosable at that point. But those are things in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. What they require is that it lasts for at least 6 months, the feelings are extreme and interfere with daily life. So what are anxiety disorders? Did you guys know there were this many?
Wow.
That's a bunch, huh? That's a lot of anxiety disorders. A lot of people, what they think of as that first one, generalized anxiety disorder, is usually the first one that comes to mind for people. And this is I was going to say your run-of-the-mill anxiety, but it's not just run-of-the-mill. It's still a disorder in that it interferes with someone's daily life. But this is excessive worry or fear about things that are not actually threats. So if I were scared excessively because there was a tiger in the corner, then that's not generalized anxiety disorder, because a tiger would actually be a threat to me, right? Mm-hmm. It's excessive fear or worry about things that are not threatening. And that's where we get into some subjectivity with diagnosis, because from person to person that may vary what they think is actually a threat to a student or to a person. But failing a class could be a threat to certain students, but then there's other students you're like, you have a high A. That's not a literal threat to you, failing this class. So that's when it gets a little bit, we have to dig a little deeper to figure out if they're fearful about something that might actually be occurring, or if they're fearful about something that there's really no evidence that is going to happen to them. Does that make sense? Okay. Some of the others that we see fairly commonly here are social anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder. Before I get into those, just a couple of little statistics. Anxiety disorders are the most common mental illness in the U.S. Around 40 million adults, that's age 18 and over, have been diagnosed with some sort of anxiety disorder. This is a formal diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, not just I feel a little bit anxious. And anxiety disorders develop from a complex set of risk factors. So it's not just one thing that leads to someone to have an anxiety disorder. There is something called adjustment disorder that is situational in nature. But when we think of things like anxiety disorders, it's usually more complex than that. It's not just I went through a change or a transition or a situation, and now I have an anxiety disorder. Those are diagnosed as adjustment disorders. So some of the risk factors can include genetics, brain chemistry, personality, and of course life events. So there's a situational component to it for sure, but it's not simply about I just came to this new school with all these new friends and I'm living in the dorm for the first time and I'm out on my own for the first time and I feel anxious. That's like a natural anxiety for a person to feel. So how do symptoms manifest in the classroom? And there are different ways, of course, that they manifest, but some of them are there on your anxiety inventory for you to be able to look at. But some of the ones, this is specifically with generalized anxiety disorders, although there are those others that we might go back to in a minute. But the first one is restlessness or feeling keyed up or on edge. This is your supreme fidgeter in class. The tapping of the pencil or the playing the drums on the desk kind of stuff, or maybe it's just the kicking of the leg constantly. That can be that kind of keyed up appearance, could be a marker of anxiety. None of these alone are diagnosable, but these are just some things that you might be able to see when it comes to anxiety. Being easily fatigued, and that really goes to number 6 as well. Part of it's being easily fatigued because they are so worked up with the anxiety that their body kind of wears out and gets tired a lot faster. And some of it is sleep disturbances. And I see clients sometimes that are like, I get 2 hours of sleep a night because I start trying to go to bed at 10, and then I sleep 30 minutes and I'm up, and then I'm up for 3 hours, and then I go back to sleep, and I maybe get a solid 2 hours before I'm up again. Due to anxiety, they wake up in just thinking, their mind going a million miles per hour thinking of things. So of course that's going to affect how they sit in class and listen. It's going to affect the way they're able to, hone in on what you're saying and comprehend it. Yes.
Can work the other way. Can sleep disturbance increase the likelihood of anxiety?
Yes, that would be a risk factor. If someone has sleep disturbances for other reasons, then usually it affects their life in a negative way. But if the sleep disturbance is medical in nature, you can't diagnose it as an anxiety disorder. You have to diagnose it as that medical, whatever the medical issue is.
I think it's just like a symptom like being hasty or pledging, they don't sleep.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah. But if it were situational, we wouldn't want to go ahead and slap a diagnosis on them and send them over to Leslie quite yet. If it were like hazing, we'd want to wait a little bit.
But that's the difference between the legitimate medical disorder, which has to last 6 months,
Right.
and a really bad week.
And a
as far as
bad
6
week,
days.
that's right. Which is hard sometimes for the students to understand. Because what they are experiencing is anxiety, and we try to be clear about that when we talk to them. Yes, you are experiencing anxiety, that is legitimate. But whether or not it's reached the point of burdening you with this diagnosis is now part of, they take those on a lot of times as part of who they are as a person. So it's not that if they need it that we don't want to definitely have them have those accommodations, but we do hesitate to put that diagnosis on somebody until we have fully met all of the requirements for it. I bet you all see a lot of students that have bad weeks and feel like it maybe even a bad semester, that's not even 6 months. So even a bad semester doesn't necessarily equal an anxiety disorder. Yeah. Difficulty concentrating or mind going blank. I think most people, when they get really apprehensive or anxious or stressed, even if it's a good thing, they can freeze. I'm not going to go into the whole like fight, flight, or freeze biological side of anxiety today, but people can freeze when put in those types of situations, or difficulty concentrating can come from lots of different areas, whether it's that restlessness that they're feeling, or their brain is on so many other things that it's hard for them to focus on what's right in front of them. There was a study published in, can't remember the journal off the top of my head, but they're talking about how social media, more and more people are researching how social media is feeding into anxiety rates in this generation right now, particularly Generation Z, not so much millennials, but looking into how that may change and affect anxiety rates, because it's just another way for your mind to be divided from what's right in front of you. And anxiety works in a similar way. So they may be sitting in the classroom, they may be looking directly at you, they may even be nodding. But their mind may be on 5 other things that they have going on and that they're concerned about. Like the person they talked to in the hallway and what they said to them and how that affected them negatively, and their roommate and how they came in the middle of the night and turned the lights on, and on and on and on and on. Irritability. I tease about this one sometime, which I probably shouldn't because I'm a professional, but how do you know if a college student's irritable? Sometimes it's hard to tell. But irritability, someone being more on edge, just more easily offended sometimes is how I will see it or say it, is if their fuse has gotten shorter than it used to be. Just a change or a variation in that is what we really look for. Not so much irritability in general, but something that's more noticeable or marked than just your average irritable college student. Muscle tension, which goes along with the anxiety, and then sleep disturbances, which can manifest in different ways actually in the classroom, but it's going to look like outside of the classroom. That can be anything from trouble falling asleep to waking up frequently, which I actually see more of that in the students than I do the trouble falling asleep. They'll kind of crash, and they just keep waking up over and over and over again. So now I kind of want to ask you guys the question of how have you seen anxiety manifest in your classrooms? We are asking that you keep all names of students out of the discussion, and any detail that might be very specifically identifying of a student, like if you said one particular thing about them that everyone's like, oh yeah, I had that student. Yeah. So if you can keep that information out, but have you seen other ways other than that list where anxiety is kind of manifested in your classrooms?
For me, I've seen it with students at the beginning of the semester. They'll seem like they're doing fine. They'll come to class, they'll be personable. But then about midway through the semester, when everything starts hitting, they will stop coming to class, or they will stop turning in assignments, and they start hiding from me. Like they won't respond to emails, or they'll say, I have a meeting with them. Okay, I can get it turned in by Friday, and then they just
May or may not.
right. And so I feel like, and then I've actually had a couple of the students like semester after semester, and it's the same pattern. So I feel like just that they seem to be operating well. They're not restless, they don't seem to have tension in class or irritable, but they're just not able to really function in class, or seem to collapse under the weight.
It's more of an internal falling apart than one that you can see. And I think avoidance should be on that last slide, because that is something I see with a lot of the students, like not checking email, or they do that. Like if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. So that avoidance is big. Anybody else?
I've been exposed to a lot of students have test anxiety. So they'll come up with this beautiful roadmap and study guides of, detail all, a lot of work put into them. And then all of a sudden, we have an exam and they describe their mind going blank, or it's very situational to that exam. So that's been my experience.
Yeah, there can be situational components inside of the diagnosis. So there can be things that are more difficult as far as their functioning is concerned. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have anxiety if it is mostly around tests. But we would be able in a clinical setting to see it in other areas. But the only place it may present itself in the classroom for some students is through test anxiety, which is interesting because everything else seems normal, all the interactions seem normal. But then when we are able to talk to them other places, we can see that maybe in other areas of their life they're having similar issues. A lot of test anxiety, right? Anything else?
Things is testing anxiety.
Is that by itself recognized as a specific disorder?
So coming along with that, kind of what she said, it may be a piece of it, but without, like, that alone can't be itself a diagnosis. And that's where we have to rely on, do we know if there's been a diagnosis in the past, or is this just something they have around testing in general? So it's really tricky.
Yes, and there can be test anxiety, could technically be a phobia, I guess, but that wouldn't present the way it presents. And the only way anxiety can be around a specific area is if it's related to some sort of phobia. Otherwise, it's going to be more widespread than that to some degree.
So can students get accommodations if they just have test anxiety, or does it have to be part of a larger anxiety diagnosis for them to receive accommodations through you?
So to get accommodations through my office, and we'll go into a little more detail about this, but we have to have documentation from a licensed professional stating a diagnosis, so we can work through that. Otherwise, we probably have 500 students in my office.
Every student would be like, I have test anxiety.
Yeah.
I do too.
Yeah, so we do have to have that true diagnosis to
I come from a tutoring background. I occasionally teach, but my students that I sit with for organic chemistry, they always do better with me than on a test. And several years ago, I had one student, I was beating my head against a wall because scores were coming back so low. And I was like, you know more than this test score shows. And so I told her, just start writing on the page, Betsy believes in me. And she gained 10 points on that test. I'm like, that's the easiest 10 points I've ever found.
Mhm.
And I tell this to my students, and they will write it on every page. And it just makes them feel better and they may just need to hear from you. I believe in you. And you might be shocked in the moment. Like it definitely needs to be personal, but I was like, I'm blown away. Is that really all we needed to do for 10 points?
That's a great example.
Mhm.
So if it will work for your students, please let them know you believe in them.
Mhm.
It seems too, while we're talking about anxiety, that there's really two different issues that affect student performance in the classroom. And one is the anxiety disorder, which is medical, which is big time, which is long term. Right. But the other issue we deal with is before it gets to the actual disorder, behaviors that reflect students are deeply anxious.
Mhm.
And it's an anxiety that may not be at the disorder stage yet, but it's chronic. And it has, part of it's involved with social anxiety, but part of it is test anxiety, part of it is I'm in a new place.
Mhm.
And all of those together, I see in my students, so many more of my students than the ones who have a clinical diagnosis. And that to me seems, that may be worth another session, because it's not a diagnosed disorder, but I think that practically for faculty, you're dealing with the same issues, even if it's not diagnosed yet.
Mhm.
And those we've had several of those, probably more than several of those come through who have come to me saying, I have testing anxiety or I have anxiety, I need accommodations. And when they can't provide that diagnosis because they haven't seen anybody about it, they haven't talked about it, they've never even gone to a counselor to discuss it. At that point, there are times where I've encouraged them to reach out to the professor and have a conversation around what that looks like, if they can help in any way, or have the professor reach out to me if they have any questions. I can't provide accommodations. I can't give them an accommodation plan, but they're always, I'm there for questions for whatever. So I'm happy to talk through, like, these are things that we could do, but they can't
I think
they
the
can't
issue,
have accommodations. But I think we kind of talked about some of those one day too. But.
sometimes students hear, oh, I don't have anxiety because she won't give me an accommodation. I have it.
Yeah.
She won't take my word for it because I don't have the doctor's note, but my life's a mess. And that's the other student.
Yeah.
I worry about too. I don't think the university really addresses how the culture that we have here may contribute to that.
Mhm.
And we certainly don't discuss how we can create a culture that can reduce some of those factors
Mhm.
that create that kind of anxiety that can be just as crippling for students academically as a disorder.
Any other things that you all have seen? And we're gonna get to some solutions at the end, I promise. We'll get to some solutions, and also, getting to hear some of what you all have done, like you talking about writing that at the top of the test. I think there's probably a wealth of knowledge in here just about what you've been able to do with students who may have accommodations formally, but also the ones that don't, for sure. The three most common we see: generalized anxiety, which I've talked about already, but PTSD, we have more students here at the university who have PTSD than you might think. And this can manifest itself in the classroom as situational, like where they need to sit within the classroom. I have one class currently where a student needs to sit against a wall where people cannot walk behind him. And that is an accommodation that they can go through a formal diagnosis and can be written into their plan. But even if they don't have those formal accommodations, they may come to you and just ask, I need to sit at the back of the class, or I need to sit at the front of the class, whatever it happens to be. And it may relate to their diagnosis. But with PTSD, that's one of the things that we'll see in classrooms. Hypervigilance is something we talk about with PTSD as well, and they can be startled easier. triggered by certain discussions. And some of the ways to work around with that, particularly if there's certain discussions that you think may be triggering, is to definitely give students the ability to step out as needed and not be penalized. If you are going to be discussing something that could be touching on past traumas that someone who has PTSD has. Anytime I discuss suicide in a classroom, I give people the opportunity, child abuse, neglect, anything that touches on trauma of any kind, giving students that opportunity to take a moment. I ask them not to leave completely, because then I'll feel like I need to go find them in their dorm room and make sure they're okay, but just to step out and get some air and get away so they don't feel trapped listening to the things that have to do with the trauma that they experience. So that's one way that you can help with that. And I've seen that quite a bit in students who they just sit there quietly and kind of try to shut down while certain things are being discussed in classrooms. And that's really not the healthiest thing that we want them to do, is to just feel like they have to basically dissociate so that they can get through class. And the ability, if they have permission to get up and step out, then that can be helpful. Social anxiety we see pretty frequently here at Lipscomb, not always to the diagnosable marker there, but social anxiety to actually reach a diagnosis has to really interfere, like they're avoiding social situations. I have a student that hasn't been to the cafeteria, not once, because of her social anxiety. That's interfering with her life as a student. She's like living on protein bars. That's not okay. That's an example of how social anxiety can get to a place where it's actually diagnosable. But there's a lot of students that deal with social anxiety on a milder level that doesn't necessarily reach impaired functioning. But it can still be very difficult for them. And this oftentimes will manifest as difficulty with public speaking, presentations, class discussions. And one of the ways I've dealt with the class discussion piece is I put students in family groups. I call them family groups because usually when students hear groups, they're like, oh. So I think adding the word family to the front usually sounds better. Maybe that's just me. But I'll put them in family groups and have them discuss almost every question I ask. I have them discuss in small groups and then have them report back, especially if it has anything that could be, I teach in a psychology class, so a lot of what they're talking about is things that could be difficult to talk about. Death and dying is one of the classes I teach. So if they're able to open up and be vulnerable in that smaller group, and then usually it's the extrovert in the group that's willing to share with the whole class what their group discussed. So that's kind of the way that we'll go about it, so that some of those who have social anxiety don't necessarily have to speak up every single time, but I still get to hear what they think and feel. And they're almost always the ones when I send it to their family groups to discuss, they're usually the first ones talking, which is so nice to hear that they're involved in those group discussions. They just don't necessarily want to say it in front of the entire class. So those are some ways to kind of help with social anxiety in the classroom, which I'm sure many of you already implement some of those ideas. All right, now I get to turn it over to Leslie for a little while.
So my office provides, as you know, accommodations for students who qualify under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that means any student who has a disability where it may limit them or hinder them in more than one or more major life activities. So originally, when the ADA came out in 1990, it was kind of your typical what you think about physical limitations. Just kind of physical access, being able, if you're visually impaired, if you're hearing impaired, that kind of stuff. When the amendment came in 2008, they actually added more things to the major life activities, and so it included learning and thinking at that point, and so that's when it steps more into in your courses, what does that look like for a student? And so when anxiety in this instance is hindering them from learning in that environment, what does that look like? So that we can help them have that access to the education just like other students. Whereas kind of like in the instance you said, a lot of times students will just shut down and they're not getting any of that information from the class. So under the ADA, we work through providing reasonable accommodations, and so it's a little bit different once you get to higher education than what you think about like IEPs and stuff in I've had a lot of confusion about actually the difference in like secondary education and higher education. So we have to think about what would be reasonable for each course. And so it really varies from, like I said, from student, it varies between courses. It could look so different. I'm sure many of you have probably had students who have accommodations, so you know how different it looks for each of your classes and each of your students. But we have to think about how do we provide an accommodation that's going to help this student, but also not fundamentally alter a course or a program requirement. So obviously we can't waive a class. If a student has anxiety about a certain class, we're not going to waive that whole class for them and not have them take that course, because that's a requirement of their program or whichever program they're in. So there are things that we kind of have to take into account on whether or not we can provide that accommodation for each course. And that's where we go back to when we approve accommodations for a freshman that comes in, they may be fine for that year, the next year. Once you kind of get into your area of studying where you want to be, some of those courses get more intense on group work and different lab work and some, and so it looks different once you get to those higher level courses. So it's really just walking through what that looks like each semester for each course. So the process, actually, sorry, I forget you're like, so the process of getting accommodations, I think a lot of people think you can just walk into my office and say, I have testing anxiety, and you get accommodations, here you go. So that's not the process. So typically walking through the process is that they would fill out a registration form, which is just basic information about themselves, kind of sharing their disability, how they feel like their disability affects them in the educational setting. And so we get that information from them, and then we ask them for documentation, like I talked about earlier, from a licensed professional. So it could be a counselor, therapist, medical doctor, psychiatrist, any professional that has a license. And it has to be some sort of documentation that shares their diagnosis, the scope of their diagnosis, so specifically how is it affecting them, because anxiety is so different for everyone, and so specifically how does it affect them in the educational settings. I don't just want a doctor to hand me a piece of paper and say, they have generalized anxiety disorder, please give them accommodations. That's not helpful. So I a lot of times end up doing follow-up if I need to with doctors or therapists or anybody. We do have specific forms that we use for some things that ask really specific questions to get a better idea of how their disability may limit them, but also how they feel like we can help them. So just because a professional suggests so-and-so accommodations doesn't mean that we can always provide those. Again, it goes back to whether it's reasonable or not. So I take those suggestions into account and kind of have a meeting with that student face-to-face, preferably. There are some who are online programs and that's harder, but preferably have a meeting face-to-face and have that conversation with them and just kind of walk through, what do classes look like for you? When does your anxiety come into play for you? What does that look like when that happens for you? Are you having an anxiety attack? Do you just not go to class? What does it look like? And just really having that conversation to get to know them so that I can figure out what may best help them. So it's really just a conversation to get to know them as a student and as a person before I make the decision on what accommodations would be reasonable. And then we have a conversation at that point to kind of walk through, what are those accommodations going to look like for you? So how are these accommodations going to help you? How are you going to communicate with your professor? What does this look like for this semester? We can revisit for next semester, that kind of thing. So just walking through that process with them. And then after they've been approved for accommodations, as I'm sure most of you, does anybody not have a student with accommodations or has never had a student with accommodations? Okay, so typically if you have a student with accommodations, an email will go out to the professors and just say, you have so-and-so student in your class, they need these accommodations, please let me know if you have any questions. And at that point, it's that's kind of like the notification that this is what you need. And then that's where professors will reach back out to me and let me know if you have any questions. If you've never had a student with accommodations, what does this look like? Maybe this is a new accommodation for you in your class. What does it look like? And then always throughout the semester, and this is one thing that I feel like faculty don't always know, like I'm here for the whole semester, like if you have questions, I'm here for the whole time. It doesn't mean I send you the accommodations, figure it out, you're done. So if things come up in the middle of the semester, if a student's not attending class, if you're not sure how to implement a certain accommodation with where you're at in the course right now, maybe it worked in the beginning and it's not working right now, reach out to me at that point. So I always want to have conversations around what that looks like. If you're not certain what that looks like, if you want to make sure what that looks like, if you just want to talk through it, please let me know. We can have those conversations. So, like as Andrea said, I have a lot of students, so I can't reach out to every professor for every student and have those conversations. But I really encourage professors to reach out if you have questions about that. So just to kind of discuss as we go into like the conversations around what to do with accommodations. Some of the more common ones that we give for students specifically with anxiety, again, going back to the testing anxiety, a lot of testing accommodations. So extended testing time, that could typically looks like time and a half or double time on a test. There are some exceptions for that, but for the most part, it's time and a half or double time. And then a lot of students request reduced distracted environment for testing. So this can be carried out one of two ways. It can be carried out if you have a conference room or an empty office in your department and you're able to be there and proctor that test for the remainder of the extended time. What it doesn't look like is putting a student in a classroom to start their test and then moving a student in the middle of the test to a different place to finish that test. So as long as you have that empty space for the entire time that they need it and you're willing to do that, or someone in your department can do that, then that is considered providing that accommodation. If you can put them in that reduced distraction and allow them the extra time. If you can't do that, if there's no space to do that, we do have the testing center. So Kathy Lincoln is in the testing center. She has 8 spaces, I believe, to test in. So students do have to schedule those. So if you have a student who you get an email saying they're receiving testing accommodations, just make sure you have those conversations to figure out if you have the space, then they can do it there. Because if not, they need to be requesting it in the testing center. So they have to know in advance if they need to do that. So if they take it in the testing center, it's a matter of you getting the test to Kathy Lincoln and then she'll get it back to you when they're finished. She handles all the scheduling of that and everything. So she should send you an email and let you know when they've scheduled their test, which typically should be the time that you are giving the test to the rest of the class. Obviously, there are some circumstances where if you have an 8 a.m. class and a 9 a.m. class and you have a test in the 8 a.m., your extended time is going to go into that next class. So we kind of have to figure out what that looks like. Does that mean you start a little bit early? Does that mean what do we need to do for that?
That can be particularly difficult around certain times of the semester, too, as you can imagine. They get really booked up over there.
Yes. And then around like exam time, like final exams, a lot of times we do testing in different areas because we've got so many testing at one time. So, does anyone have any questions specifically around testing accommodations before I move on? So the last one is probably the one that some of you may be cringing about. I don't know if any of you have this one. The flexibility with attendance and deadlines, and or deadlines. Some students have deadlines and some students have attendance and some have both. But this is an accommodation that we don't give as commonly because we really have to think through, is this helpful for the student, or could it be hindering them? Could it allow them to be kind of withdrawing and not attending class if they have that accommodation? Could it allow them to get behind on assignments because they have the flexible deadlines? So we really kind of try to have those deeper conversations when a student has requested that specific accommodation to decide whether it's something that could be beneficial for them. And it's something that you really have to work through with the professor individually with the student to determine what is reasonable for that class. So I don't know what assignments you have. I don't know the layout of your course. I don't know what everything looks like. So it's up to you to think through what does reasonable flexibility look like for your course. I'm happy to answer questions about that and to help in that conversation, but I can't just say, okay, this student gets so-and-so extra time on an assignment. And it may look different. They may need 2 days for a shorter assignment. They may need 3 or 4 days for a longer assignment. It just kind of depends on what the student needs. And so this semester, does anybody have students with flexibility this semester? Okay, so you probably all know the contract that went out. Does everybody know this? So kind of put that into place to have that conversation between the professor and the student. And then I'm also there. There are sometimes where I've met with the professor and student when they couldn't come to either an agreement or they just weren't sure what reasonable would look like. And so just having that conversation to work around what that looks like. And with this piece of it, I always encourage students to continually communicate with their professor. When you need that accommodation, let them know that you need it. Don't just assume that you're using it on every assignment. Don't just assume that every time you're absent, it's because of that, because not all students do all of their assignments, number one. So if you're not doing an assignment, you're not gonna know if they're not doing it because they just don't wanna do it, or if they need the flexibility. So it's their responsibility to communicate that and just let you know when they need that. If you feel like a student is really falling behind, then a lot of professors usually reach out to me and say, do you know of anything else going on with the student? And that's when we can kind of pull together and have that conversation of, this is what this looks like, let's look at the rest of the semester and see where we're at, that kind of thing. So this is probably the most complicated one that we have, but we try and work through it when we do need to put that in place. So I appreciate all of you being patient with us as we work through that. And just being flexible with that. So does anybody have any specific questions around that accommodation piece of it? Yeah.
That's a new thing, the contract.
Yeah, the contract is a new thing. It may look different next semester. That was something we just kind of put into place for the semester to start those conversations. But as we have more time over the summer and kind of work through things, it may look different, more as like a conversation guide instead of necessarily a contract with all the questions and stuff. So that was put into place because when I started at the end of last semester, probably from day 3 or 4 that I started, I already had professors and students contacting me saying, either professors were saying, this student's been absent for 3 weeks and I don't know what to do. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know who the student is. Like, so it was a lot of confusion between professors and students. Students didn't understand that I need to communicate when I need this. I just thought I had it all semester and I just do what I need to do. So there was a lot of just non-clarity around what that looked like. So in the middle of the semesters, I just kind of wanted to get something in place so that we could have a better idea of this is what this is going to look like, and just having them have that conversation. Because a lot of students and professors maybe hadn't had that conversation around what that looks like. And so I just wanted something in place to kind of guide that. So, yeah.
I apologize, I had to step out early. How do you determine what's reasonable? In other words, if I allow 2 absences in the class and I've got somebody who's been out 6 times, is that still reasonable?
Yeah, so that's something that I can't decide that for each course because I don't know. Some courses are designed more where the course is mostly online. You come to class and you participate in class, but it's not, you may not have group work, you may not have group discussions, that kind of thing. So you could get the information. So it may not be, not that attendance is not important in that class, but they can access more information in a course like that than they could in, say, a course that has a lab where you can only set it up that one time, or a course that's designed around group work. So it's really kind of up to the design of the course, what that looks like, and then having that conversation between the professor and the student. I'm happy to be part of that conversation if you have questions. But it's up to kind of the professor and the student to work through that in the beginning, and then if not, I'm happy to answer questions and step in and see.
The one that gets me in this, having had it now, is a pop quiz. And how does that figure in? So they are absent due to the accommodation. You throw a quiz that nobody knew about. Now they know about it. They have time to study before they actually take the quiz.
Gotcha.
So then we now got an undue advantage.
Yeah.
The purpose of the quiz was, I mean, so how do you do that without giving an unfair advantage to the students? I don't have a good answer is the reason I'm asking. I've gone.
Yeah.
I've heard that from so many different professors. I've heard that exact same frustration.
That's the first time I've heard that one. So
Could you, for example, because that happens in literature too, literature classes, but could you have an alternative assignment? In other words, you can't give them a pop quiz.
Yeah.
But could you give them a take home? It's a different assignment, but it accomplishes the same outcome. It's not easier, it's not harder. It's
Well,
just a
but the
different kind of
outcome,
assignment.
the purpose of the pop quiz is to keep them up. So the assignment doesn't, they can catch up or just study specifically for that. I understand it does, you know, for this one particular lecture. The volume of material I present, if you miss a week's worth of material, you can't catch up. You're pretty much done for the semester. And so then how do you force them to stay up
Yeah.
So I don't know, I see what you're saying, maybe,
Mhm.
well, you can't do the quiz because you knew it was coming, but take this home and fill this out, or,
I'll tell you the solution I do, and it may not work for you.
Yeah.
But because my exams are comprehensive,
right?
my tests are comprehensive, I'm gonna get them on the material one way or the other. For those students, I have a double or nothing policy. If they miss a quiz, then the next quiz counts twice.
Oh, that's actually a good idea.
If they miss 2 in a row, the first one goes down to 0, but it keeps me from having to do a makeup. It means that they're instantly caught up, and they've gotten
So
to the
you better
test.
be prepared for the next one.
So be prepared for the next
That's actually a really good idea.
Mhm.
My students have, on the evaluation, say that, Dr. Hearn, I hate the quizzes, but they've made me keep up with the reading, so make the next class do the quiz.
That could be, but no, that's the reason we use it, everybody says that could be in the contract in a discussion at the beginning of the semester.
Yeah, and that's kind of
Okay.
things that you can work through, like, if you were to miss a quiz, what is this gonna look like? And so those are things that I can definitely be part of the conversation about. But, like, you figured out how to do that on your own, I'm assuming you just kind of implemented that. And so it's things like that you can think through, like, what are other options? And I've had professors who have said, you know, I give a test and I give it back in the next class. What does that look like? Do I need to rewrite a whole nother test? What is it? And so we work through different situations like that. So it may be something that you come up with a solution yourself, and we can just talk about that and make sure that it does, you're still allowing them equal access to that information and proving that they understand that. But it's just going about it a different way, which is really what accommodations are, is making sure they're getting the information and they have that access to it, but they may need it in a different way than other students.
Part of what I hear a lot of times from professors, because some think when it's a mental health accommodation to call the counseling center, but some of what I'll hear is, what am I legally allowed to impose? What am I legally allowed to ask about the accommodations and that sort of thing? So I don't know, I want to put that to you, because I think part of the reason what professors are hesitating is, can I say no to the parameters of a certain accommodation? So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
And that one, I mean, it's tricky. It's different with every accommodation. There's no like, this is what you can say, this is what you can't say. Let's just lay it out here. So as far as making sure that you are, I guess, within your legal bounds, a lot of times I've heard professors say, well, I just have to give them whatever they ask for. And if they ask me for the whole semester to make up assignments, then they get the whole semester, and I can't tell them no, and I can't keep them to a deadline. So the point of, with that flexibility contract, going back to those deadlines specifically, working through what is that extended deadline. And when you've agreed to what that extended deadline is for a student, you can hold them to that extended deadline. It doesn't mean, okay, well, I'll give you 2 days, and then if you need 2 more days, and if you need 2 more days, and if you, I'm not saying you can't do that, but within your legal bounds, you don't have to say, okay, well, you just get whatever you need at this point. Whatever you want is what you get. I think a lot of professors hesitate to kind of put those parameters around things because they don't want to do something that's illegal or to get in trouble. And so once you've kind of had that conversation and there are expectations, which was another piece of giving that flexibility contract, is because both the professor and the student know what the expectations are for moving forward for that semester. So once you've had that conversation around what the expectations are, then at that point you can hold them accountable to those expectations. You talk through it with them. Okay, well, we've reached this extended deadline and you still haven't turned it in. What does that look like? And there are times where professors say, it's 3 weeks past the deadline. At this point, I can't accept that assignment. We need to move on to whatever the next assignment is. So that is something that you can do. I think a lot of professors don't think you can just say, no, I'm not accepting it at this time. So it's just kind of again, it's personal, whether or not you decide you want to give them another extension after that, or whether or not you decide on any accommodations really, but it comes more into play with like flexibility and stuff like that. So if you want to give them another deadline, if you feel like they need another deadline, feel free, by all means, you can give it to them, but don't feel like you have to keep giving them all semester and not hold them to anything at that point. Is that
Yeah, I think that's what I've heard from professors is what, basically the course just becomes whatever they want it to be as long as they turn it in by the last day.
Which is not the point of accommodations. So the point of accommodations is to give them equal access to the course, just as other students have. another student is not, you may work with another student who doesn't have accommodations, who you may say, okay, I understand that things have been going on, maybe you get a couple extra days on assignment. So what you're not gonna do is, okay, well, you just have all semester, just do your work as you wanna do it, just kind of figure it out. If you don't feel like doing it right now, don't do it. You're not just gonna kind of give them free range to do, because you have course requirements. And so and a lot of courses build throughout the course, and you can't finish assignment 3 without having done assignment 1, because that's part of assignment 3. And so just kind of like keeping up with the class. And another thing is, it's not beneficial for a student to be working on assignments from the first half of the semester when you get to the end of the semester and you're trying to learn all this new information while keeping up with the old assignments. It's not going to be helpful for them. And a lot of times that's when students come to me and they're like, I can't keep up, I can't keep up, I can't. Well, that's because we're behind on 15 assignments at this point. So what can we look at? These are the things that maybe we do need to focus on making up, and these are the things that maybe it would be better for us if we just kind of, not that I ever encourage not doing work, but when a student has come
You're
to
the
me
one
that's,
encouraging them not to do that.
yeah, I do, that's it, that's what I do. No, but when a student comes to me that's behind on 15 or 20 assignments, at this point in the semester, that was due the first week of the semester, we kind of have to look at, to keep you on track for the rest of the semester, what does that look like for these assignments that are missing? And a lot of times that's where I encourage them to have that communication with the professor and say, what am I even allowed to make up at this point? Because a lot of times they'll just start working on things and making it up, and then the professor doesn't accept it. And so at that point, they've wasted all of this time and effort when they should have had that conversation at the beginning to kind of see where they're at in the course and what they can make up at this point. Does that make sense? Again, I'm not encouraging them not to do their work. But
I have a question from an advising perspective. Once a student has identified themselves as having accommodations in a given semester, it sounds like, I think this is what I hear you saying, we should have that discussion every semester, and they should have that discussion every semester with every professor, because not all courses are equal.
yes,
Things do get harder as you go through. And one of the issues I see with students is that they'll do it in freshman year, and they figure it out, and they don't do it until halfway through a course their junior year, and they realize they can't manage.
Yeah.
And it seems like that once a student identifies to an advisor, that advisor ought to recommend strongly every semester. Have the conversation now. You may not need to pull the accommodations card, but you're only cutting your own throat if you don't have that conversation.
Yeah. And that's what I encourage them, especially my students with accommodations when it comes to like flexibility and stuff like that. You need to have this conversation, even if it's just a testing accommodation, which is the most simple accommodations that you could get. You need to have that conversation, because you need to know if you're taking your test somewhere in the department, or you need to know if you're requesting your test. So you need to have that conversation up front. And it's really all about encouraging them to have those conversations instead of getting to the middle of the semester and not knowing what to do and just kind of drowning at that point. But a lot of students I realized that last semester, is they started out with their accommodations and they would tell me, well, this is what I did last semester. Okay, but this is a different semester, this is a different professor. And I have told them, even if you have the same professor for all of your classes this semester, it's gonna look different for each class. So you need to have that conversation around each course, not just each professor. You need to talk about what it looks like for each course.
Is it legal to ask a student? Let's say you don't know anything about the student. Is it legal to ask, have you ever used learning accommodations for a class?
If you have a student, if you've received an email about a student who's getting accommodations, you can reach out and have a conversation about what those accommodations will look like. Obviously, you can't ask them like, what is your diagnosis and that kind of stuff. But if you've received that communication that a student is receiving accommodations, then you can have that conversation with them around what those accommodations will look like.
Yes, I'm thinking mainly about the students in the first year who haven't told me, I haven't got a sheet.
Yeah.
I'm seeing all sorts of signs that
Yeah.
something's amiss.
Yeah.
Can I just in a very general way ask if they've ever had accommodation?
I have had professors refer students to me, not necessarily ask if they've had accommodations, but if you notice that they're struggling or getting behind, then you can let them know about my office. A lot of students don't know that it's available.
Mhm.
They may have received accommodations in high school and just not realized you could do that in college, or they may have gotten through high school fine and now they're in college and they are trying to figure it out. And I've had some students who say, well, I was diagnosed in middle school, but I never used accommodations because I didn't need them. Now that I'm in college, I kind of need them at this point. And so we can put that in place now. But I have definitely had professors recommend students come see me. It's just a matter of saying, I know that you're struggling in the class right now. If you feel like you need any help, here's what's this information.
I've done that before. Yeah, I've given specific examples, like, I noticed in class that this is happening and this is happening. I don't know what your situation is, but I do know that we have a place on campus that you can talk to somebody and see if you might be eligible.
Yeah.
That way I'm not asking or.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. How do I get them to your office
I would just
legally without violating?
Mhm.
I mean, I think the way that she did it is great. She's not asking them if they've had accommodations, if they need it. She's not even saying, do you need accommodations? She's just saying, if you need it, here's the information. And I think that's the best way to kind of get that out there is, and that it's hard. I think a lot of professors don't want to say that because then it's almost like you're telling them like, hey, you need help, you need accommodations. But in reality, maybe they do. They just don't realize that they can get that help. And so directing them to my office, directing them to help, just like you would direct a student to tutoring or direct a student to the academic success center, just directing them to my office. So.
If a student's never been tested for accommodations, does look come provide that test?
Testing, no, not exactly. If you're talking about like ADHD testing, we don't do that in the counseling center, but for anxiety or depression, PTSD, we can do that in the counseling center. We certainly don't write the letters for all of the students.
Yeah.
But,
I try and steer away from asking for all of the letters.
So you could
but
certify that a student has, for instance, type of accommodation on campus.
it has to be a licensed therapist, so if they're seeing an intern, they cannot do that. But yes, a licensed therapist here on campus can write
And
that.
is there a cost to the student associated with that? And will they
Everything I
contact,
do is free.
will they contact your office or your office?
Well, I always recommend they see her first, just to make sure they're getting exactly what they need. And also, after she meets with them, say I refer a student over to her, not from the counseling center, but as a professor, she can meet with them and maybe they don't need accommodations, but they might need the academic success center, but she decides that and helps shuffle them where they need to go. And then lets me know if she needs documentation from me. As a counselor, if they're my client, she'll let me know that she needs that documentation.
If it's something other than anxiety, like a dyslexia,
No, we
Something
don't
like
do
that.
that.
So they would either have to come in with that diagnosis with documentation, or we would have to refer them somewhere to get that testing.
y'all keep a list of local,
We have some lists. I need to get a better list going, but I can always find different locations. The counseling center is a good resource too. I usually will reach out and say, hey, where can I send a student for this type of testing?
and will that always be out of pocket for the student?
Any licensed psychologist could do, licensed psychologist, not counselor, could do that type of testing, learning disability testing.
Do you have a ballpark idea how much that costs?
Anywhere from like 500 to several thousand.
Mhm.
It's not insurance, billable usually, right?
Not usually.
So when we have a student, and we have students who don't have insurance, and we know they have this issue, what's the next thing? After we send them to you?
If they have dyslexia, they have to figure out a way to pay for it. They have to have the letter to get the accommodations. So she can't give it to them. I mean, we've had some, I can't say we because it's your office, but we've heard of some students come in and they have it really difficult. We wish that we could change that, but legally, how the law supports the students, it also provides the parameters that says we can't provide accommodations unless you have X, Y, Z. So it also puts those boundaries in place.
The student has to qualify as a student with a disability, a diagnosed disability who has limited function in one or more major life activities. So I have to have a documentation to prove that. I can't just take a student's word who says, I have dyslexia or I have anxiety. Otherwise, I would have every student on campus receiving accommodations. And she's right, there are some students who have come to my office and I can tell that it's something that they're really struggling with and they're having a hard time, and I wish that we could help in some way, but like she said, the parameters of the way it's set up is just, all I can do is refer them to get the testing. But that's all I can do at that point.
Sometimes if they have a general physician back home that they've seen for a long time, they'll work with them on that sort of thing. That's just not always true, that they will do that. But I have seen them be able to go back to maybe a doctor who's known them since they were 3 and figure out a way to get documentation without having to go through a new doctor. Whether or not that's ethical is none of my business. None of my business. I don't get in the middle of that. I'm not getting in the middle.
So most of my questions kind of center around the students that are probably not in your program. The ones that I've had that come with accommodation, I usually don't have very many issues with them. They're usually pretty familiar with their diagnosis. I love the contract that you implemented. It's very, I just haven't had any problems with the students that are seeking those official accommodations. My issues, I think, come more from students that do not fall under that category with an official diagnosis. I've had students bring me a doctor's or a counselor's note because they're asking for extensions. I've had students who just don't show up. I try to call them in, schedule a meeting with them. I have one student in particular who confided in me that he felt he really struggled with anxiety, that he was having trouble getting up out of bed in the morning, and he was an off-campus student. And I referred him to the counseling center. I think he maybe scheduled an appointment, but then he just stopped showing up. And I don't know whatever happened to him, truthfully. He dropped out. So I guess I'm just also kind of wondering, what are the supports or recommended steps to take when you have students in your classroom who are not going to meet the having the diagnosis part, but that are not in crisis per se. I mean, they don't seem suicidal, but they need help. You want to be able to follow up with them. I wish I could have just called his parents and said, do you know that he's not, when you leave for work in the morning, he's not getting out of bed and going to class. I know I can't do that. That's kind of where I'm struggling. What is going back to the reasonable accommodation, what is a reasonable accommodation for someone who doesn't have those official contracts in place? What are some ways that we can support those students in our classroom? I don't know if you are able to speak to that, or if that's a different session entirely.
No, we can speak to it for a moment, for sure. I mean, some of that is, some of what we wanted to talk about relates to kind of brainstorming some of those ideas, for sure. It really is up to you, though, as a professor, outside of what's legally mandated, which is much less than what we might think. What accommodations you want to make for any given student that comes to you. If I have a student come to me and ask for accommodations, I always refer them to Access first, though. That's always my first step, is to send them to Access, because I think that they need to know that there is this option and opportunity. So if they don't meet, or they can't get the letter, or whatever that is, then usually I'll work with them individually, depending on the issue that they're having and how large of accommodation that they're asking for. I try to work with those students on an individual basis at that point. So, but I am interested to kind of hear what some of the rest of you all have done, the successes maybe you had, particularly related to anxiety. I think depression can be a very difficult one as a professor. When you have students, they're particularly the ones that will stop coming to class for large amounts of time, and it can be worrisome, especially if you're very aware and tuned into your students. You'll see some of that, but specifically around anxiety, what are some of the ways that maybe you've accommodated students that don't necessarily have formal accommodations? What's worked for you in your classes?
One of my mentions was the double or nothing. I do that on tests too, especially the first test. I'll tell students, if you walk in and you realize, I never had Dr. Hearn before, and I thought I should have studied this way, it's all wrong. I tell them I'll go double or nothing with you on the final. Just pick the test up, take it home as a study guide, now you know what to do. For students who aren't in accommodations, who are normally anxious, that helps them. I teach a lot of non-majors. But the one that's worked best for me is the doubling off the quiz. Sometimes they'll show up and they'll have forgotten. Sometimes they don't want to miss class, but they're not ready for, but that's proven to be, it's not perfect, but it solves a whole lot more issues for the students and for me than trying to do makeups creates. And if the purpose is just to incentivize keeping up, I mean, that's a pretty simple one.
Yeah, I dropped into a class. A chemistry professor had emergency surgery, and so I got the last half of a semester. And I had 2 students that I finally figured out I had never met them because I didn't know how the new system worked for pulling a roster, and it was just sign a sheet of paper. We're going to do 14 hours of lab today. And when I finally sat down and realized, oh my word, I've not seen a face yet, because there were 2 weeks before me with subs, and then I had the last 5 weeks of class or 4 weeks. And one student I reached out to, and you read his email, and I was like, holy cow, this is depression. I can't diagnose it, but everything the student is telling me is depression. And Dr. Klinger, the chair of our department, said I needed to email Sam Smith. And I emailed, I don't know who Sam Smith is, but that seemed to work. He ended up contacting, for the on-campus student, the residence hall, just to see the person in their room. And the other one was an off-student campus, that I was not the first teacher that had issues with attendance, but that email got things going. Because I didn't know, that was, within a day of my figuring that out.
So if you guys will look in here, if we can speak to this a little bit, Sam Smith isn't actually the go-to person for that anymore. But there is something online called a BIT report that you can file, and that's Behavioral Intervention Team. If you just Google BIT, Lipscomb University, the form will pop up for you to be able to fill that out, and that goes immediately to a large number of people on campus that are working together for the students. That includes access, security, people in student life, counseling services, spiritual life, residence life, are all part of this team that if you're worried about a student's like safety, you would file that BID report. And it's in your My Lipscomb if you go to My Lipscomb, but honestly, you have to navigate like 3 or 4 places to get to it, so it's easier just to Google BID Lipscomb University and it'll take you right to it. But
So
if you look,
is that only if you're worried about their safety? Like an emergency kind of thing?
It's technically,
doesn't have to be an emergency, I can say that.
yeah, it doesn't have to be an emergency, but if you feel like there's threat to harm to themselves or
That's a
others.
threat to harm.
But we've also had reports when students have not shown up to classes
Yeah.
for 3 weeks.
Yeah.
It doesn't
Or
just have to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It'll ask you when you file the report, mild, moderate, like
Mhm.
how quickly do we need to act on this? And you kind of have to use your best judgment, but you can say mild, they just haven't been showing up to classes, and that is okay. But in here, you'll see the residence hall directors are all listed, and Lori's saying, I got all their cell numbers, so you gotta start spam texting them. And then Lori's saying down here is usually the first person in residence life that you would contact if you needed to check on a student just to see if they're okay, like they haven't been coming, and you've tried to email them over and over and over again, and they're not responding, and maybe you're worried about them. She would know who the residence hall director is, and then she could also go and check on them as well, so that's another option.
And if it's an off-campus student, what would be the point of contact?
You would still do the BID report.
But there's no one out, like, there's no one
No.
here to call.
Security's number is on here that you could call, but technically, yeah, if it's off campus, no.
Okay, so the BIT report's really the only
For off campus.
thing for
Yeah.
off-campus.
But they're really, like, it's been really beneficial because even having a grad student in an online course, I was able to submit like the little BIT form last year, and they were able to follow up on that student. And, you know, I was able to find some things out that I didn't know about the student, which was really helpful.
They'll move very quickly.
Yeah.
They move very, very fast.
But
So
it's for serious concern.
it's
Or
for
missing
any
class.
sort of, it's not for like missing one
Well,
class.
sure.
No.
It's for
But if they've
any
been gone
sort
for
of
3
like
Right.
any sort of behavioral issue that
Yeah.
comes up with a student that you're concerned about that you can't handle yourself.
So if the student's not coming to class for 2 or 3 weeks, and especially if you notice some like other signs and stuff like that, then that's something that we could try to address. Whether it be we just have somebody from residence like go meet them and just get eyes on them and make sure they're okay. Maybe they meant to drop the course and they forgot to drop the course.
Right.
Things like that. might happen.
Mhm.
So I know our time is up. That's pretty much all we had anyway, but if you have a specific question and want to hang back and talk with us about a specific situation, I can speak for myself. I can stay till 3. So,
Mhm.
thank you guys.
Thank you all.
I
Yay.
do have my business cards if anybody needs them with this.
I have her number on my wall. Hey, you're welcome. Leslie has her extension.